and discuss what the United States and the international community must do to expose and to combat this extreme violence. These horrific crimes are at times trivialized or falsely portrayed as myth, rumors, or misinformation, but they are very real. Our distinguished witnesses today will bear witness to the unthinkable physical and psychological agony committed against innocent victims by witch doctors and human traffickers. I would note parenthetically, I first heard about many of these practices on a trip to Lagos back in the year 2000. While I was there on a human trafficking trip. We had just passed the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, and I was shocked to hear how the juju men were putting women at grave risk and telling them, after a very horrible ritual, that if they do not conform to what the traffickers order them to do, they and their family members and friends would be horribly injured, if not killed. I heard it. I had not heard that before. I brought it back to the TIP office and raised it in several of our hearings as something that we need also to be pushing hard against. And this is the same, but even worse, not worse, but similar in many ways, but this is directed at other outcomes. Crimes of ritual abuse and sacrifice involve mutilating and usually murdering victims to remove certain body parts, bodily fluids, or organs for use in sadistic rituals. These rituals are commonly ordered by people who believe that conducting these horrific acts will somehow bring them wealth, health, or other good fortune. Much of this abuse happens while the victim is still alive and without anesthesia, and many die afterwards from shock, pain, or blood loss. In sub-Saharan Africa, we know that these crimes are especially prevalent around election seasons, when many children and adults go missing, never ever to be found, or to be found dead and body parts missing. This is because to this day, some politicians use rituals to gain power. Tragically, children and women are especially vulnerable to this abuse and are particularly sought out by the perpetrators of these crimes. Many rituals abuse or sacrifice innocent children. Albino people, particularly albino children, are at the very high risk of being kidnapped, trafficked, and abused for the sake of certain rituals. In Africa, it is estimated that hundreds of thousands of children each year are victims of ritual attacks in some form. It is absolutely unacceptable that these crimes continue to occur, affecting so many vulnerable children and robbing them of their futures. And it is deeply disturbing that cases continue to be underreported and inadequately addressed by law enforcement. Furthermore, ritual abuse and sacrifice is an especially pernicious form of human trafficking that often involves the trafficking of organs. Last Thursday, our subcommittee had a hearing especially focused on child trafficking, and we heard from one of our witnesses, Jean Lankin, a survivor of both the Rwandan genocide. Matter of fact, she saw her father killed at the age of 10 right in front of her. She was a Tutsi. And child sex trafficking, that organ trafficking is especially prevalent in the trafficking of children, but is so often overlooked. Organ trafficking for use in rituals is a worldwide phenomenon. However, traffickers even go so far as to set up warehouses to sell human flesh. We must do more in our anti-trafficking efforts to specifically address these heinous crimes. While we need to better understand what we can and must do to end this egregious crime, this past March, the House voted 413 to 2 to approve legislation that I authored, known as the Stop Forced Organ Harvesting Act of 2023. The bill, also co-sponsored by Chairman McCall, Kathy Manning, Bill Keating, French Hill, and others, does the following. It amends the Foreign Assistance Act to require reports on forced organ harvesting and trafficking in persons for purpose of removal of organs in foreign countries. The imposition of serious sanctions on any person the President determines funds, sponsors, or otherwise facilitates forced organ harvesting or trafficking in persons for purpose of the removal of organs, civil penalties that include up to $250,000, criminal penalties that include up to $1 million, and imprisonment for not more than 20 years or both, and sanctions that include blocking and prohibiting all transactions in property and interest in property, and making such persons inadmissible to the U.S. and ineligible to receive a visa. And we need to make sure that we do more on this particular issue, which is exactly why we're having this hearing. I want to thank our very impressive witnesses for joining us today. I'll introduce them formally in a moment to discuss this. abuse. We are very, pardon me, very thankful to have Dr. Alan White, an expert on how and why these crimes are occurring, especially in Western Africa. Dr. White, as I think all of us know, served as the founding chief of investigations of the United Nations-backed Special Court for Sierra Leone, and his experiences in Sierra Leone and Liberia have allowed him to bring important attention to atrocity crimes and hold perpetrators accountable. It's essential to listen to the voices of survivors and those who aid and help those survivors. So we have very, very capable and knowledgeable experts, again, who I will introduce just in a moment. But I thank them for their voices, their strong voices, and their courage, in Ms. Fuller's case especially, for speaking out. I yield to my good friend, Ms. Wild, for opening comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much to all our witnesses. I believe that this hearing is a vital opportunity to address all types of violence against children, not just across the African continent and in certain contexts, but globally and in every form. Violence against children, whether state-sponsored, committed by armed groups, or conducted within closed-off communities or even families, constitutes the most egregious violation imaginable of our common humanity, dignity, and principles. Tragically, violence against children was exacerbated by COVID-19 in many regions around the world. It continues to reach staggering levels, including in what has been one of the world's worst conflict zones for decades now, the Democratic Republic of Congo. A few days ago, on September 8th, UNICEF's representative to the DRC said, "Violence against children in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo has reached unprecedented levels. There are few worse places, if any, to be a child. The country has the world's highest number of UN-verified grave violations against children in armed conflict." End quote. We must hear this alarm, and we must ask tough questions about the lack of adequate protections to guard against the global hunt for unfettered access to critical resources like lithium that is fueling the violence in areas like the DRC. I want to conclude by saying a few words about one of our distinguished witnesses, Josephine Aparo. Her courage in the face of unthinkable violence and hardship is a testament to the extraordinary strength and resilience of the human spirit, as is her subsequent commitment to advocating on behalf of children, women, and families who have also endured this kind of violence and hardship. Thank you so much for this work. Let us strive to be worthy of her example by working to provide the needed levels of resources and support to combat the intolerable scourge of violence against children. And with that, Mr. Chairman, thank you, and I yield back.
I say thank you to my good friend, the ranking member, for her statement and leadership. I'll begin with the witnesses in the order that we would request that they proceed. Beginning first with Mr. Obed Bayam Vigisha, who is the program advisor for the Kayam-Paisi Child Ministries, where he has designed and managed projects in all spheres on child protection. He has 13 years of working experience as a technical program advisor for child protection with humanitarian agencies in Uganda that include the Kayam-Paisi Child Care Ministries and World Vision Uganda. He has designed and managed projects in child protection, emergency, disaster, and war response. He has coordinated the development of best practices for prosecution-led trafficking in persons investigations in Uganda, together with Human Trafficking Institute in 2020. And he successfully inspired the development of the Trafficking in Persons Prosecution Guidelines in September of 2021. We'll then hear from Ms. Miriam Fulla, who is the Trafficking in Persons Protection Manager for World Hope International, where she works on anti-trafficking and gender-based violence programs in Sierra Leone. Ms. Fulla helps families and communities support recovering trauma survivors. A psychosocial counselor, she has served 5 organizations in Sierra Leone over 16 years, including World Hope for 11 years. Her recounting of survivors' stories shows families, communities, and government leaders how mental health affects us all. Ms. Fuller informs communities so they can create policies that protect people at risk. She is an expert on protection issues and how families can care for reintegrated survivors. We will then hear from Dr. Alan White, who is co-executive director of the Advocacy Foundation for Human Rights. Dr. White is a retired U.S. federal law enforcement senior executive, where he served as Director of Investigations, Defense Criminal Investigative Service, Office of Inspector General, U.S. Department of Defense, and responsible for oversight of all defense criminal investigative services, law enforcement operations worldwide. Dr. White is also served as senior executive with the United Nations-backed Special Court for Sierra Leone, where he served as the chief of investigations responsible for directing all war crimes and criminal investigations for the Office of the Prosecutor concerning those bearing the greatest responsibility for civil war in Sierra Leone. His efforts led to multiple indictments and convictions, including former Liberian President Charles Taylor, who was the first sitting head of state indicted and convicted of war crimes and receiving a 50-year sentence. I'll never forget the picture of Charles Taylor at The Hague, looking down and obviously depressed that all of his horrific behavior had caught up to him, but none of that would have happened without Dr. Alan White. He was tenacious, had death threats against him, ongoing and every day, and yet he persisted and did so much to bring justice, whatever justice there is, because for the families of the lost ones, there is no justice, but he did put these people behind bars, and I can't thank him enough. He is also a partner in BW Global Group, LLC in Washington, D.C., where he works on issues such as human rights violations, anti-corruption, and government affairs globally. We will then hear from Ms. Josephine Aparo, who is founding member of the Global Survivor Network and International Justice Mission. Ms. Aparo is a social worker with a passion to serve women, children, and families who have survived violence. Josephine was orphaned as a young girl in northern Uganda, and she lived through a two-decade civil war that tore apart her family and her country. Her own story of struggle and triumph fuels her desire to help other women stand strong. She is an aftercare manager with International Justice Mission, and of course IJM is well known to this committee, going back to the very beginning when we wrote the Victims Protection Act. IJM was right there on the ground helping us to write it. So thank you for your work. She is now on staff with International Justice Mission in Ghana, where she supports child survivors of slavery on Lake Volta. I yield first to Mr. to Obed for and use whatever time you feel is appropriate.
Chairman Smith, High-Ranking Member Wild, and representative on the committee. Thank you for this opportunity for me to present a hearing titled Efforts to End Ritualistic Abuse and Sacrifices in Africa. My name is Obed Byamugisha. I come from Uganda, which is in Africa. I'm here as a first-hand witness of what has been happening, not only in Uganda, but across Africa. I'm one of the first people who responded to this ritualistic abuse and child sacrifices 13 years ago, and I've been fighting it all through these years. In my life, I've rescued more than 28 children, directly those who were formerly abducted, and out of the 28, 2 of them, they are boys. Their private parts were cut off completely. And unfortunately, some of the regrets I have is that I have buried more children than those I've saved. What is ritualistic abuse and sacrifice? Basically, this is a practice that involves mutilation of body parts when the human is still alive. Unlike other forms of violence, this is the worst form of violence I've ever seen in my entire life. I've worked in the refugee response to rescue unaccompanied and separated children, managing projects under UNHCR. I've worked in disaster under UNICEF to save children and women and men. I have never seen the worst form of violence like this one. It's different from trafficking because as we put strategies of surveillance to rescue children, with this one, they are murdering people, more so children who are targeted from where they live, and the survivors or victims don't die instantly. Some of them even are mutilated for over a period of 1 year. What happens is that they target the most parts that they look out for are mostly the internal organs, the heart, the liver. Mr. Chairman, Smith, I came with photos and videos as evidence for that, but what happens is that they cut out using knives, machetes, and they open the body, especially the stomach, and then they start to draw blood first. After drawing blood, they start to remove each part that they want. It is very traumatizing and gruesome, not only to the victims, but to affected families, but also for us, the frontline rescue team who go to rescue people. In my entire life, this is one of the most or the worst experience I've seen, because I thought rescuing refugees was the worst. But rescuing children, boys and girls, is the worst experience. Chairman Smith and Ranking Member White and representatives, I remember one of the children I've rescued, I tried to rescue, who died, was a girl called Joy. Communities gave me an alert, and I ran to rescue her. They had cut her stomach, and they were drawing blood. When we reached there, I was driven on a motorcycle, and I held her in my hands. She grabbed my shirt very stiffly, and she started telling me in a giggling voice, "I want to go to school. I want to go to school," like 3 times, and she passed on. That did not stop, of course, from year 2010 to other years. These cases have continued to escalate. There are many voices that I've heard, and it's very traumatizing, Chairman Smith. The prevalence, so far, in my country where I come, in Uganda, it is reported that on average, a child is killed every week. If you go to countries like Nigeria, it is worse. They are escalating at a high speed. It is reported by the UN agencies. The annual reports have actually provided statistics of some of these. In Senegal, in Namibia, Swaziland, Liberia, Tanzania, Zimbabwe, more than 30 countries, this issue is running very fast. And the cause is basically, number one, belief in superstitious practices practiced by witch doctors. It is believed that human tissue, blood, and body parts mixed with a potent concoction from a witch doctor can provide social problems, including wealth, including barren people that they can be able to give birth, even to specific sexes of children. What is scaling it up recently is politics and commerce. In our countries where we do elections, the curve goes high. In Uganda, there is a time when we were voting, and in 1 week, 13 cases were reported, and I attended 9 burials out of 13. And these children, they are underreported. Some of them are invisible. So Different parts of Africa, now election is commercialized. There are those who believe that for you to win an election, you have to kill many children. As we celebrate democratic elections, behind it, there is blood that is shed. And they are targeting the most innocent members of society, most especially children, who are very innocent. The death rate currently for people, that's why I said it is the worst. When I was still rescuing children in a war, especially South Sudan and in northern Uganda, we could have higher numbers of those who survive. But with this one, when they start to cut the body, 90% die. And even the 10% who survive is because some people have come to rescue. They die when they are trying to fight for life. Chairman Smith, one of the worst experience is hearing the voice of a child trying to fight for life. We need to do something because the cases are escalating highly. The International Committee of Red Cross last year reported 64,000 cases of ritualistic murder, and in Nigeria, and they said that over 14,000 actually were children. Chairman Smith, just from Africa, an average primary school has 5,000 children as an enrollment. If you divide this number of children, it is equal to 13 schools. Just imagine 13 schools, children in 13 schools disappearing in just 1 year. And the reason is equated to ritualistic murder. It would have been on the agenda of every leader if it had happened. But these ones are underreported, they go invisible. Of course, we've had so many frustrations. We have cases which go more than 10 years, 15 years. And children die, their mothers and fathers wait for justice, and they never get it. The quest for justice is the wrong road. And it is a bumpy one, in a sense that even us who have been fighting it, myself, I have survived death for so many years. Sometimes they attack us. There's a time I was attacked at night and they nearly killed me. Why? Because we don't have the legal, we have gaps in the legal regime in our countries. There are no laws about addressing human sacrifice. And if you look at even, it's not under the category of trafficking. So we need to do something, because they attack children, they murder them, they mutilate their bodies. And if you look at the interventions now under trafficking, it doesn't yet so far now highlight ritualistic murder as one of the issues, yet a big number of children die. The life of those who have survived is another horrible journey. I have one of a survivor who was attacked when she was 2 years. She spent 1.5 years in the shrine. Every day they were cutting her and drawing blood. She became disabled. Everything is done in one place. She can't even feed herself. She got a mental problem. And she's fed. She's looked after like that. There are even parents who have waited to see justice and they pass on when they have not seen justice. In Africa, only Uganda is where we've drafted a law to address human ritualistic sacrifices. And that law, I drafted it and we worked with my government. But when you look at West Africa, they are struggling. This is a high and organized crime that sometimes even people in government are actually highly involved. People in security. That's why families find it hard to achieve justice. Last month, I was working with one of the mother who lost her 6-year-old She discovered the remains after the body had, it was so many years, so we found the bones. She said, I will never bury my daughter until I receive justice. So she wrapped the bones. She wrapped the bones in the cloth. I tried to convince her that we give Sarah a peaceful send-off. She said, never until I receive justice. But one time we were at court, she asked me, who can ever hear our cries and help us? I thank the committee today that you've given me the opportunity, because in my heart there are many voices of those who did not make it here, those that I have gone for their last burials. Chairman and the ranking members, the practice, the ritualistic abuse and child sacrifices has penetrated our communities. And these some of the appeals I want to put forward to the committee. Number one, if we could have this ritualistic abuse and child sacrifices put under the category of trafficking, it will galvanize all of us to one common voice to address them. Addressing issues of harmful practice, especially superstitious belief, requires everyone. Like the mother who wrapped the bones of her daughter, she's waiting for justice. So many others in different parts of Africa, in Benin, Nigeria, they have seen the body parts of their children. They cut the arms, the legs. Last month I received a case. A boy was tied at the back. The hands were tied at the back and the legs. And then they started cutting different pieces on the body. So by the time we came, we found the head off. There are many children whom we've buried without body parts. So having the trafficking as ritualistic murder under trafficking can help. Number two, we need funding. Efforts to address this is escalating at a higher speed. Like I said, during elections, during festive seasons, there are many children. Now we are in September. Parents begin to get worried in October, November, because during the festive season in December, the curve goes high, the death rate goes high. Remember, I said very few survive. So we need funding for interventions that can address these vices. Then the other is we need to amend the Trafficking of Victims Protection Reauthorization Act, so that we can, as a severe form of human trafficking. Then the other is we require TIP country report to break out ritualistic murder for the purposes of organ harvesting. And then we need to implement a zero tolerance policy, Chairman. There is a lot of aid that goes through to our states. However, there is a problem of political will. In most of the countries, like I said, only Uganda has enacted a law to address this. But if we could draft a zero tolerance policy, it could help at a certain degree. We can even direct USAID funding towards prevention efforts. Prevention, because the victims, we have so many victims, but some of them, they can't help themselves. Some of them have become adults. We are carrying them in wheelchairs. I've told you about two boys we are caring for who have no private parts. They were totally cut. One of them was able to get plastic surgery to help him. It's a horrible experience. Then we need incentive. We need to sensitize everyone, and we need to help our governments so that they are able to provide a better legal regime that is very protective, so that we have laws that can be used to even implicate the culprits. So societies grow based on the way they protect their children. And Chairman Smith, there are things sometimes which can wait, especially from our communities. Sometimes we can even wait to build schools so that we do life saving, because schools are meant for the children, and where children are killed, then our societies are not able to grow. I want to thank you very much for giving me this opportunity, for listening to me. My role was to give the voice of children. We've lost so many. We really need to stop this, and together we can. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Obed, for that very, very powerful testimony, and for your recommendations, and for just bringing this committee fully up to date on what you have seen and the rescues you've effectuated, and also the horror of hearing those voices cry. Thank you. Ms. Fuller.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Weil, and distinguished members of the committee. My name is Miriam Fuller, and I thank you for this opportunity to testify before you today on this all-important subject of torturing and trafficking children for the purpose of ritualized murder and sacrifice. I am here today as a first-hand witness and as a person who has been speaking out boldly against the torture and ill-treatment of children in Sierra Leone for over a decade. I directly worked with victims of trafficking, mostly children, as a counselor and presently as a protection manager for World Hope International in Sierra Leone. As the protection manager, I oversee the only specialized shelter for trafficking survivors, mostly females in Sierra Leone. In February 2012, World Hope Anti-Trafficking Program opened the Trafficking in Persons Recovery Center for survivors of human trafficking with funding from the office to monitor and combat trafficking in person at the U.S. Department of State. Still operational today, the center provides holistic and comprehensive aftercare to survivors with the ultimate goal of reintegrating them into a healthy Sierra Leonean society. The program intends to interrupt the violent exploitation cycle of human trafficking, including sex and labor trafficking, as well as trafficking for the purpose of organ trafficking and ritual murder. The survivors we served are human trafficking victims who were able to come out of the abuse alive. This is not so for those who lost their lives, because another human being thinks they can only achieve their dreams for prosperity and healing by harvesting the body parts of another human. This is also human trafficking, and we have served some survivors of this type of exploitation at the center. In this part of the world where I live, the rights of people are often violated with impunity, but this happens more so to children who are considered personal property of their families. The protection of children is mostly left in the hands of parents or communities. The government has signed many treaties, including the Child Rights Act, but the government and people who are supposed to act or hold people accountable for such heinous crime often pay lip service to this all-important subject. I am testifying behind the screen today because I'll be labeled as a person bringing a bad name to my country and knowing fully well what the consequences might be. I am willing to do this because families, mostly impoverished ones, are seeking answers and want justice for their loved ones. I want to be the voice of mothers, being one myself. If, Si- if Sierra Leone is not safe for children, then mine are also not safe. This subject is a no-go area even for the so-called educated and enlightened families and enlightened. Families who have been affected are mostly impoverished and are left to grieve silently. If not for one human rights non-governmental organization making a loud noise about it, I am speaking out today because I am a mother and I fear for the safety of my children. Organ harvesting and child sacrifice in Sierra Leone are mostly linked to ritual murder. A child will be kidnapped from school or in their community and will be handed over to a native doctor who will typically take the child into deserted areas where they will be killed. They will mostly harvest organs like their private parts, breasts, tongues, and intestines. Children, especially girls, are mostly vulnerable because sometimes the native doctor will demand the blood of a virgin. This was exactly what happened in the story I'm about to share. I am present here today with a survivor that I had worked with closely, and recently turning 18, she gave her consent for her story to be shared. Mary, not her real name, was only 8 years when she was brutally raped by her mother's boyfriend, whom she considered a father. He had built a huge house he wanted to rent out, but was particular about who the tenant should be. He wanted a rich individual or a big organization to rent the property. He waited for 2 years for his preferred tenants, but none showed up. He believed that this was due to bad luck. Desperate for answers, he sought out the help of a native doctor who told him that for him to attract such favors, he would need to shed the blood of a virgin. Distinguished during his trial, which I attended to support Marie, this perpetrator testified in court that he wanted her to die, but thought of the relationship he had with the mother. So instead of having her killed, he raped her in this building until she was bleeding profusely. He was indeed able to spill the blood of a virgin, all in the name of attracting favors. Marie was lucky to be alive, but she still suffers emotionally up to today, years after the ritual abuse. Marie's mother recently suffered a stroke, which she believes to be a result of post-traumatic stress disorder related to the abuse of her daughter. What this perpetrator did was not only a heinous crime, but it is forbidden culturally since a man is not supposed to have sexual intimacy with both a mother and a child. Marie was able to get justice because an organization like Wallop International was supporting this family through the process of getting justice, taking her to multiple court sessions, and helping to expose the bribes that the perpetrator offered the mother. If she, in her quest for justice, she persisted in her quest for justice, and I was glad to be by her side for the duration. The perpetrator was ultimately sentenced to 15 years in prison. However, this is not the case for many others. It is for these others that I stand here today. And Chairman Smith and distinguished members of the committee, it is worth to note that today we are focusing on children, but the oldest survivor we have worked with is a 54-year-old woman. And she was particularly targeted because the ritualists wanted this person to rape a woman in her menopause until she bleeds. So it's not only particular to children. Adults, women and children are also facing the same crime. The issue of child sacrifice and organ harvesting is so shrouded in secrecy that getting data on this all-important issue is challenging. Data generally in Sierra Leone is challenging to obtain, but even more so for this issue. Ritual murders are mostly prosecuted in court under murder generally, but not in relation to it being a ritual. So it is hard to get data, including the extent of the crime. But based on our data, we have been able to work with 7 families. Fortunately, one of the survivors was rescued from the house of the ritualists. These are some of the few who we are fortunate to be alive. People are more vigilant to these types of crimes when events like national and chieftaincy elections are approaching. This fear is legitimate because people running for elections will go to great lengths, including paying for rituals to gain favorable election outcomes. During these election seasons, even school authorities put in measures to help protect children. For example, they would like a particular person to pick up the child and present the child's identification card before the child can be picked up from school. If they have concerns, they will not allow for the child to be picked up except by the designated person. People are mostly afraid to speak out because it is believed, and mostly the case, that crimes like these are committed by the rich and powerful, mostly politicians, or by people with strong political affiliations. Families, especially those who have loved ones to this crime, are not willing to pursue justice because for them, going through the long and delayed court process will not be beneficial. In parts, it is seen as beneficial because after the expense and time spent, even if they do get a conviction, they can no longer get what they really want, their loved ones back with them. It is for all of these reasons that I was willing to travel thousands of miles for the first time in my 46 years of life to speak the truth for those who care to listen, hoping that it will not fall on deaf ears. Even if taking the necessary steps will save one's child, it will have made it worth it. Let's put aside all bureaucracies and our hidden agendas to fight this heinous crime. We can no longer be quiet. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, and thank you for your bravery in coming forward. And we do hope that the semi-seclusion that you have here at this hearing, I mean, we fully understand the risk you are taking. So thank you for that courage.
Thank you.
I'd like to now yield to Dr. Alan White, such time as he may consume.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank Chairman Smith and Ranking Member Wild and the other distinguished members of this subcommittee for holding this very important hearing. It's long overdue. I also want to publicly commend Congressman Smith, who I've known for over 20 years, for his tireless efforts and unwavering efforts in seeking justice and accountability for countless victims of human rights violations from around the globe. You provide a voice that otherwise would go unheard and a platform to those victims who have suffered and continue to suffer with no one to turn to. Your steadfast support is globally recognized and very much needed in these troubled times we live in, and where so many atrocities are being committed around the world. As a co-executive director of the Advocacy Foundation for Human Rights, we target human rights violators that are engaged in public corruption and human rights violations, and we seek justice and accountability for those victims of such atrocities. We're actively engaged in conducting investigations and compiling information about those individuals who are committing ritualistic killings, especially in Liberia. The Foundation has received disturbing information about the frequency of such killings and the allegations linking it to the Executive Mansion, the Office of the President, and other high-ranking members and government officials. Details of these atrocities are difficult to obtain. Sources to the Foundation are endangered just by speaking out, and I will discuss this later in my testimony. Over the past 20 years, I've been actively engaged in seeking justice and accountability for victims of human rights violations and conducting criminal investigations and war crimes investigations, including crimes against humanity on the continent of Africa, most specifically West Africa. The Special Court for Sierra Leone, where I worked, established to investigate and prosecute those who bear the greatest responsibility for the civil war in Sierra Leone, which lasted from March of 1991 to January of 2002, and resulted in the deaths of over 70,000 people. Our investigations led us to neighboring Liberia, who suffered 2 civil wars. The first was from December of 1989 to August of 1997, and then again they rekindled from 1999 to 2003, where over 250,000 Liberians were killed. While serving as the chief of investigations, I investigated some of the most horrific and unspeakable human rights violations no one could ever imagine that someone could inflict on another human being. The horrors of civil war are always tragic. However, to see those involved in the commission of killing and torturing another human being by engaging in ritualistic activities was something I had never seen before and, quite frankly, prepared to deal with. Yet shortly after I arrived in Freetown, Sierra Leone, I recall in August of 2007, a news story where a 70-year-old man seeking to become a paramount chief of a local village, a political position in a traditional system of local government, an integral element of governments, was convicted of a ritualistic killing. I learned quickly that ritualistic killings were commonplace, particularly in West Africa. This story reported the man seeking to become a paramount chief believed in black magic, and in order to get elected, he needed to sacrifice a young child, and in this case, it was a 9-year-old boy for 800,000 leones, which is roughly 160 US dollars, from his family who was desperate for money. Reportedly, he gruesomely killed a 9-year-old boy by slitting his throat and removing his liver and taking some blood to local witch doctors in the neighboring country of Guinea, where they would use in making a liquid concoction he could drink and give him what is known, as we've heard before, juju. This was a term I learned later meant power and used in ritualistic killings by rebels fighting in the civil wars, both in Sierra Leone and in Liberia. Surprisingly, I learned the ritual killings or human sacrifices to local deities were customary parts of West Africa, where some people commissioned killings to obtain body parts for magic spells to gain political power and influence. Early on during my criminal investigations of war crimes and crimes against humanity, I heard routinely about ritualistic killings involving various rebel groups and the warring factions in Sierra Leone, which included the Revolutionary United Front, the Armed Forces Revolutionary Council, and the Civil Defense Force. The war started in Kailahun, so we started our investigations in that part of the country, where we uncovered numerous mass graves, and in most cases, victims were civilians and including children. Their identities were mostly unknown, although some names were given. However, our witness interviews that the RUF were identified primarily as the alleged perpetrator. There were several causes of death of the victims. Reportedly, they were locked in houses and burnt. In many cases, it was because of ritual human sacrifices for protection, and gunshot wounds and knife wounds. One of our witnesses I recalled involved a female ex-child combatant who advised the ritual killings were routinely practiced on enemy fighters or on civilians, including children. Sadly, the rebels from various warring factions would boast about killing their enemy, many of which were young child soldiers, and eating their heart, drinking their blood, eating other body parts, claiming they received extra power from doing so. Sadly, this practice continues today in Sierra Leone and surges during election periods, which you've heard from my colleagues, where people running for office believe that sacrificing a person, mostly younger boys and girls, because it's believed that the younger they are, the more power they get. The Voice of America in Freetown in 2012 reported on the so-called ritual murders during an election and time have been a part of African society for centuries. In Sierra Leone, some believe ritual murders increase during election time because some politicians think they will gain political power from others' human body parts. In October of 2021, a senior government official who reported directly to the president of Sierra Leone was indicted for an attempted ritual murder of 6 virgin girls in Freetown. The chief minister in Sierra Leone has been accused of forcing primary school teacher to kidnap 6 virgin schoolgirls for ritualistic purposes. Fortunately, the plot was foiled when one of the whistleblowers came forward and reported it to police, which led to the chief minister's arrest and indictment. However, he was released from custody while investigation continued, and to date, no prosecution has occurred. During the 14-year Liberia Civil War from 1989 to 2003, there were so many cases of gunmen, some of them child soldiers, eating their victims' hearts and other body parts, so much so that the Catholic Church issued a formal denunciation of these practices, which was documented in the published book from Stephen Ellis, The Mask of Anarchy. It is well documented that during the civil wars in Liberia that ritual killings were commonplace, and one of the most notorious rebels engaged in such horrific acts, his name was Milton Blahyi, also known as General Butt Naked, a feared rebel commander who fought in the Liberian Civil War. He testified before the Liberian Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where I publicly ate children's hearts, and admitted to taking part in human sacrifices as traditional ceremonies intended to ensure victory in battle. He also told BBC his forces had killed over 20,000 people. During the first Civil War from 89 to 96, there were other reports about Charles Taylor and their rebels' accounts reportedly forming a group of cannibals called the Top 20, of which he was a member. Reportedly, the group comprised of Taylor and 16 rebels of his known army group called the National Patriotic Front for Liberia, engaged in human sacrifices in Taylor's house. The Ellen Johnson Sirleaf administration, during her 12 years from 2006 to 2018, office was plagued with ritual killings, and despite vows to bring an end, they continued. The same problems continue under the current President George Manawiya administration, and unlike Sirleaf, there were no insiders reporting on her direct involvement with ritual killings. However, we've received information that the current administration has been linked to the ritual killing of children. Sources advise us that the police are only allowed to investigate these matters in a conspicuous or very superficial manner, as not to get too close involved. Also, because of the high-level links to the government, it is taboo to say anything about it, otherwise you could be the next victim. One of the most notable allegations of ritualistic killings involved mysterious disappearance of 3 young men who were hired by a proprietor of the St. Moses Funeral Parlor to undertake a task in Bong County. On 17 October 2020, Robert Blamo, Siafa Boima, and Bobby Binkwe were reported drowned in a river in Fuama District, Lower Bong County, when a canoe that they were allegedly riding capsized while returning to their homes. They were hired to do a piece of work, small piece of work called a piece of job, by a mining company owned and operated by Mr. Moses Aso. He was the owner of the St. Moses Funeral Parlor, and his partner, Mr. Abraham S. Manuels. It was reported that Mr. Abuaso, that the 3 young men were drowned. The bodies were retrieved by him and never returned to the parents. He has close ties to the president and the government of Liberia, and through the Ministry of Justice, who he has contacts with, they have failed to provide an update or release the outcome of the investigation or a report on the circumstances that led to the conclusion they drowned. Why didn't they release the bodies? The aggrieved families believe their children are being kept in a sacred place to be used for alleged ritualistic purposes. The family members sought the assistance of the international community, including the U.S. Embassy and the United Nations. As a result, on December 10, 2021, the United Nations issued a public statement. A human rights expert today called on the Liberian government to promptly investigate a series of killings that have occurred this year, some of which have been reported linked to ritual practices. At least 10 people have been killed in unclear circumstances in 2021, including 5 in September. reportedly with suspected link to ritualistic practices or political motivations. According to the information received by the Special Rapporteur, Morris Tinball Bentz, 3 of the most recent victims were either former officials or had links to high-profile former politicians. Even a recent death of some girls involved in a political campaign held by the president's party, CDC, sparked outrage by the citizens, and allegations of their death were done for ritualistic readings. The local headlines in a local newspaper said, Liberia, citizens to President Weah. No ritual can help you from leaving office after the elections. On August 24, 2023, the New Dawn News reported several residents of Montserrado County have told incumbent President Weah that no amount of alleged human sacrifice, ritual, and money can prevent him and a coalition of his organization, the Coalition of Democratic Change, from leaving office. We want President Weah to know that no amount of human sacrifice and money can help in this election. These were potential voters in Montserrado County. Our foundation will continue to work on this issue and applauds the work of this committee and its members. We hope this hearing will shed a bright light on a very dark issue plaguing many African countries, and especially Liberia, who experiences despicable crime against humanity during war and in peace, yet it doesn't stop. These involved need to be exposed and prosecuted for these heinous crimes. The killing must stop, and we hope that your legislation can affect change and stop the madness once and for all. So we hope that you can codify your recommendations into law and make this become a publicly known issue. And our foundation will continue to work with you and this committee in seeking justice and accountability for the victims of these horrific crimes. Thank you.
Dr. White, thank you so very much for all of your past work, which has led to so many convictions of war crimes, war criminals, and your ongoing work to protect the innocent. Thank you. I'd like to now yield such time as she may wish to take to Ms. Josephine Aparo.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Wild, and other members. Thank you for this opportunity. Chairman Smith, I also want to recognize your leadership in combating human trafficking. My name is Josephine Aparo. I worked with International Justice Mission in Ghana. I am a survivor of violence and war. I'm a founding member of the Global Survivor Network, a movement of international leaders advocating for safety in our communities. I grew up in Uganda, surrounded by violence during the 21-year-long war. One night, I was 11. I remember a loud crashing sound. The door was being kicked in. I opened my eyes to a tip of a machine gun. A rebel soldier stood over me. I froze in fear. My grandmother pleaded with the soldier. She lied. This child carries a sickness. He left, and I woke up to an empty village. They had taken every child, and I was the only one left. For our safety, my family moved to a camp for internally displaced people. But even there, women and children were raped, machetes and rocks were used to kill people. I chose to become a social worker because of that violence. I believe no child should suffer like this. Today, I wish to expand our discussion beyond ritual abused or sacrificed. Our fight is against violence, and our desire is to protect our children. At International Justice Mission, we work with local authorities to strengthen justice systems to protect people living in poverty from violence in Uganda, Kenya, and Ghana. I specifically work with child survivors of labor trafficking in Ghana. Many of these children are lured away with the promise of a good job or the hope of going to school. Instead, they find themselves at the mercy of their traffickers. One such survivor is John. John was very little when he was trafficked onto Lake Volta in Ghana. Day after day, he was stabbed and beaten. One day, he was struggling to untangle a net underwater. Every time he came up for air, his boardmaster kept hitting him. John's forehead split open and blood ran down his face. The boardmaster left John in the water, shivering, bleeding. All night he struggled to stay afloat. Finally, a passing fishing boat rescued him. The next day, John is one example among many. Numerous children are exploited and trafficked, left to die because they are disposable. I know we are here in Washington, D.C., and children like John can seem so far away. But I encourage you, children are children everywhere, and they deserve to be safe. This is a fight to protect children from violence. We have a choice. We can either ignore it as a problem far away, or we can choose to act so that children are protected from violence. In this regards, I have 4 recommendations. First, invest in programs to reform children's justice systems. U.S. funding helps transform justice system for people like John and helps to end exploitation, especially invest in trainings and remove barriers to report abuse. Second, the U.S. should consider developing a child protection compact agreement with Kenya to combat child sexual exploitation. Following the successful model in Ghana, which has increased anti-trafficking efforts, Kenya is a hotspot for trafficking with low reporting rates, but this can be changed. Third, include survivors in policy discussions. Expand the U.S. Advisory Council on Human Trafficking to include global experts with lived experience. If you remove the requirements that council members be a U.S. citizen or legal resident, you can gain survivor expertise from around the world. Finally, please reauthorize the Trafficking Victims Protection Act to maintain crucial U.S. influence in combating trafficking worldwide. It is almost 2 years since the previous authorization expired, and I urge you to promote passage of this key legislation. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Ms. Aparo. Thank you all. Just a few points on your recommendations, and I thank you for them. Later this week, I will be reintroducing the reauthorization of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. And thank you, Mr. Obid. Thank you, Obid, and thank you, Dr. White. We do have language in it that says this, in terms of now including this terrible crime of ritualistic murders. This includes practices involving the killing, mutilation, removal of organs or body parts of a person for sale or for purpose of witchcraft, rituals, or any harmful practices. So we've taken, thank you for that insight, that advice. We will introduce it this week. And it's, we did pass it. I want to note for the record, Karen Bass and I did a full reauthorization 2 years ago. It did pass the House in a totally bipartisan way, and then sat in the Senate for a very long time. So we're going to try to, the good news is, and I think many people understand this, you certainly understand it, without reauthorization, the programs continue via the appropriations process. So we have lost nothing, but we haven't gained new provisions like this one that we're going to add with regards to ritual killings. So I think it's important that we do the reauthorization, but only if you have some additional things. I mean, that makes it much more important, and we do have additional provisions. So I thank you for that. I do want to thank Obed. You briefed us along with some wonderful people who are here, some of from World Hope, and for the work you did with regards to making my staff and I further sensitive to this issue. I had heard about it. I know there are UN resolutions on it at the UN Human Rights Council, but even there they call it alleged. There's always that wiggle room that is it really happening or not. And you have driven home not only is it's happening, it seems to be getting worse in some areas. And of course, for any child or even 50-plus-year-old person who gets abused like this, this is insane that it has been allowed. And so just a couple of questions, but we did include the language in our reauthorization, which we will be dropping this week. And my hope is that it will be on and I will respectfully ask that it be on the markup for October for the Foreign Affairs Committee. So there's no more delay. I do also like the other ideas that were suggested too here, which we will put as part of the record from the World Hope Stop Child Sacrifice for the great work that they're doing. But there are several recommendations to us, and I do believe it. If the TIP report and the data calls that go out from the TIP office and from the Secretary of State, and of course from the ambassador at large, aggressively are asking for this information, it becomes then part of the information that we're trying to glean from every country. It then becomes information that could lead to a Tier 3 rating, which means sanctions to that country. So it will really, I hope, more quickly make all of the countries that are allowing or even promoting this terrible abuse to know there's a penalty. You're going to be sanctioned. And we do have the mechanism for it with the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. Let's now use it. So thank you. This is where informed and articulate and above all, absolutely committed people make all the difference. And we do listen. We do listen to the people who have been traumatized too. That's something that goes back 25 years with me and others. If you don't listen to the victims and the people who are helping the victims, you'll get it wrong. So we have listened with very, very attentive ears and learned from you. So thank you for that. Just, Dr. White, you had mentioned that we is linked to ritual killings. It was in the middle of your testimony. To me, it jumped off the page as to, no politician who thinks they can glean power supernaturally, I guess, from doing this they should not go unaddressed, and they should not. There should be accountability for that kind of abuse. And as you said, you saw it with Charles Taylor and the Top 20 and some of the other things you mentioned in terms of abuse. This needs to be fully exposed. Now, the UN has done resolutions at the Human Rights Council, but again, even there, and I'm glad they did, but they do say alleged. They use words like that to suggest that it may not be clear that it's actually happening. And from your testimonies, it couldn't be more clear. So maybe you could speak to that. I would ask, we do have varying numbers. The UN independent expert that said that there's 20,000 victims of this. Is that order of magnitude what the numbers are? And Obed, you might want to speak to that. And then I have some other questions, but I will yield to my colleagues and then come back. Dr. White.
Sure, thank you, Congressman Smith. There's a lot of public information that's been reported on the ritualistic killings from whistleblowers to you name it, the people that's been tortured over there. Our foundation, because of the work that we've done on the continent for 20 years, continues to receive significant and, sadly enough, alarming news about the links to the current administration there. It's very difficult to get specific information simply because these people that are known to report do end up being dead. So we're continuing to do that. We'd like to work with your committee as we get more specifics on it. But the elections are coming up October 10th. There have been an alarming reported rates of these type of ritualistic killings, and they're not just children. And there's some linked to the president's party that's ongoing right now. And I would hope, I know this is the House, but I would hope that during the confirmation hearing of the new ambassador, Mark Toner, that these questions come up about ritualistic killings and what is the U.S. policy, what do we plan on doing about it? Because it's no secret, this has been going on since the day I arrived in Sierra Leone, and it occurs all over Africa. It's just, unfortunately, a majority of it that we've been able to report on includes in West Africa, but we know it occurs in Uganda, Nigeria, and certainly Sierra Leone and Liberia. But I think exposure and prosecution of these people is absolutely critical. As you heard one example, the chief minister that reported directly into President Biya in Sierra Leone, because it was publicly reported, he was arrested, indicted, but then released, and nothing's ever happened. The same thing happens in Liberia. Prosecutions go nowhere. So I think that should be the focus, in my opinion.
Chairman Smith, high-ranking member Wild, and members. The statistics, of course, in all African countries, cases of ritualistic abuse and sacrifices are underreported. And the statistics is not actually adequate, but of course there are some figures already which have been captured by different agencies. Like I highlighted, one of it is the United States Department Country Report on Human Rights Practices for African Countries 2020, which highlighted cases reported in different countries in West Africa. I also talked about the International Committee of the Red Cross, which has actually highlighted 64,000 cases of disappearing persons more across Africa, and only in Nigeria alone, over 25 people and 14,000 and more are children. I talked about Uganda, where a child is killed a week, but when it comes to festive season and times of election, the cases double, triple. So, and the other thing is what we talked about is just because, like I said, ritualistic abuse and sacrifices are not yet part of trafficking, so even the reporting itself is still a challenge. So if we can categorize this and make it clear in the TIP report, more statistics will actually come out. Thank you, Chair.
I would just want to thank each of the witnesses individually for their commitment to this and for being the voice of the children. Mr. Mugisha, I hope I didn't botch that too badly. I really appreciate the fact that you have taken on the responsibility of being a voice for the children. I can't even imagine the emotional scars that you have from doing this kind of work. It's hard even to listen to, let alone to live it as you have, and to do so much life-saving, in many cases, work, and in other cases, the sad work of burying these children. Ms. Fulla, as I understand it from your testimony, you traveled here from Sierra Leone, first travel to the United States ever in your life. She's nodding assent. Thank you for making that extraordinary trip to tell these stories. And Ms. Aparo, thank you for telling your own devastating story. I thank you for expanding the discussion to include all violence against children, and for expanding the scope of our inquiry. And finally, Dr. White, thank you for your long commitment to fighting against war crimes and promoting human rights and against corruption, which sadly seems to be a recurring pattern. The corruption I'm referring to in countries where this is prevalent. I have to say, just at the outset, this is a difficult subcommittee to serve on. There is almost never anything that is uplifting about the testimonies that we hear at our various hearings. We get a few moments of uplifting when we are told the story of a survivor or people doing good work, as all of you are. But ultimately, the foundation for what this subcommittee does is very, very difficult to listen to. But I feel very, very strongly that we as Americans, and especially as American elected officials, despite our own many domestic problems, have an obligation to hear and see human rights abuses and suffering around the world. I don't think that we as a country can claim the mantle of being a world leader and the most powerful country in the world unless we use our resources and, quite frankly, our privilege to fight against exploitation of all humans around the world, and especially children. I feel fervently about that, and that is what keeps me going on this subcommittee, despite the challenges. I will tell you that I recently traveled to Kenya. I visited the refugee resettlement camp at Kakuma in northwestern Kenya, which was a difficult visit because essentially it's 500,000 people who are refugees from other African countries. Originally it was primarily Sudan, but now the refugees are from many countries, most of which are war-torn countries. And I also spent an hour or so while I was there with a large group of unaccompanied children, all of whom, by the way, appeared to be in very good spirits and playing with, and they had playground equipment and that kind of thing. They were very young, and they were still, I think, in the initial stages of being happy to be somewhere, even without their parents, where they were safe and fed and able to play with other children. And even as I shed a lot of tears that day at Kakuma. But even as I shed those tears, I realized that as difficult and heart-wrenching as their stories were, in many ways they were the lucky ones, because they had gotten out of countries such as you have described. And I, as a parent myself, I often think, how can any parent turn their child over to somebody to take them to a better place or a safer place? But I understand, when I hear the testimony that you've given, I can imagine feeling as though that is the only recourse for the protection of your child. And it's, needless to say, it really is very, very difficult to process. And after Kenya, I went on to Nepal, where we studied human trafficking and forced labor, but also were able to see a lot of good work being done by U.S. agencies, but even more so NGOs that are supporting the survivors of human trafficking. Very impressed with their work, but I left Nepal with a sense of urgency and commitment to supporting these NGOs and the U.S. government agencies who've dedicated themselves to the prevention of these tragedies and the support of the survivors. But I also left with somewhat of a sense of pessimism and I'm not a pessimistic person, I'm generally an optimistic person. And my pessimism was born of the long ingrained caste system in Nepal that essentially relegates many, many people into lives of poverty, which of course is often part of the root of this. And I bring that up because I have the same sort of feeling today as I listen to you, that I will do everything I possibly can, and I pledge that to you, and we will on this subcommittee. But I still have this underlying sense that these ritualistic acts have their genesis in long-held beliefs and tradition and cultures, which unfortunately have permeated many of the governments in question, and that makes it really hard to combat when you're fighting against centuries-old traditions and cultures. Having said that, as hard as it is to fight, doesn't mean that we shouldn't. And I think we have an obligation, an absolute obligation, in the name of the children to continue to bring forth evidence such as we've heard today. And I really thank you all for what you've done. Your testimony, your collective testimony has been so expansive, there are almost no questions needed, but I'm going to try to formulate one or two questions to see what we might do that's more effective. And Ms. Aparo, I'd like to ask you specifically, and we know, we've heard from you and others, and I've seen it with my own eyes, that violence against children takes place across the globe and in all types of situations. That poverty is almost always the one common denominator. So I guess now I'm looking for one of those uplifting moments that we rarely get. Are there any examples of substantial progress that you can tell us about anywhere in the world, Africa or elsewhere, that you'd like to highlight? And by that I mean programs that have worked or that are showing signs of working, governments that have been more responsive, and ways in which the U.S. has interacted with those governments, perhaps bringing about some change. And any kinds of comment you'd like to make on things that have worked or you see them working.
Thank you, Representative Well. I think that in Ghana, where I work, and we have a lot of women and men who are really committed to preventing children from suffering this horrific violence. However, the only challenge that they have is the resources they need to be able to do the work that they are supposed to do, because they are under-resourced. I want to let this House know that we are working with survivors to raise awareness and use their voices to actually talk about this crime, so that people understand and they are moving government officials to take action to end child trafficking. And so I believe that there is hope, because now communities are being empowered. Parents who claim that it is because of poverty, that's why they are giving their children out for trafficking, are now beginning to understand that it's a crime to do that. And so survivors are using their voices to raise awareness in the community, and we are beginning to see change. We are seeing survivors reporting cases to government officials. We are seeing police recording cases of abuse. We are seeing the justice system act. The only challenge that we have is the under-resourced, and I would strongly recommend that there should be a commitment in giving more funds to these justice system units who are responsible for protecting children from violence. Thank you.
Thank you for that answer. It usually does come down to an issue of resources in terms of the U.S. support. I fervently believe that it's very important that we do so. I'm very concerned about reductions in support over the last several years. And I thank you for that specific suggestion about funding for children's justice programs, which I think is something, I hate to be so blunt about it, but I think it's something that people can actually understand and recognize what that kind of funding is going towards. It's something tangible, and that's often needed when we are approaching the difficult issue of what kind of resources we can provide. Are there any other perspectives that you would, and I'm staying with you, Ms. Aparo, as either a survivor or an expert, that you would like lawmakers and policymakers to understand?
Yeah, sure, Representative Well. I would strongly recommend that survivor voice be included into policy making, so that they can speak. Right now, we need the survivors to take their seats on the table where policies are made, where program designs are happening, so that they are able to inform our programs.
Thank you. And I did see in your testimony, and I heard you reference it when you were speaking, the importance of including survivor voices, and you mentioned specifically the United States Advisory Council on Human Trafficking, which was created by Congress in 2015, but that right now there's a requirement that council members be a U.S. citizen or legal resident, and you've made the recommendation that the policy be expanded to allow survivor experts from around the globe. I think that's an excellent suggestion, at least as perhaps, even if they're not full members, to be associate members so that they are ensured of a seat at the table. And I thank you for the concrete recommendation. That's very helpful, because sometimes we have a tendency to recognize a problem but not really know what we can do to address it. You've already addressed the resources issue, and I think you've addressed this, but are there other areas besides funding of child justice programs that you see as really needing more investment to function well?
Yes, Representative. Well, I see that much investment needs to be directed to specifically training. We are lacking trauma-informed approach in the way of case management. And if institutions, the justice system is not strengthened along trainings, cases will not be coming, perpetrators will go free with the crimes that they have committed, and there would be no accountability. Because I can share my experience as a survivor. When I was working in Uganda, I used to accompany women who suffer intimate partner violence to courts. And then, even before the court, at the police station, a woman would be discouraged to record a statement because it is assumed that it's a normal thing when a husband beats you. And that discourages people a lot. And even when a brave woman takes a step to push forward the case to court, some of the justice officials would say, how dared you report your husband? And who is going to pay fees for your children? Who is going to feed your children? And this is not a trauma-informed way of doing things. And so I strongly recommend that the justice system need to be strengthened through trainings so that cases are effectively managed to reduce the prevalence of violence against children. Thank you.
Thank you. That's another very concrete example, and I think it's an excellent one. And I would agree. I was going to ask you about trauma-informed approaches, so you went right into that. But and one of my reasons for wanting to know about trauma-informed approaches is because reporting a crime in itself can be a very traumatic experience for these people. You know, I'm glad for the times that you were with somebody who was making a report, because I'm sure you gave them great strength, but there need to be more people like you with that background. With that, I'm going to yield at this point, Mr. Chairman, and let you ask some more questions. But thank you so much. I could be here all day with you, literally asking questions, and I just am truly and deeply appreciative.
Yes, please, Dr. White.
Just one thing, I'm all about accountability and the work that I've done, and you have to change behavior. And one of the things you ask for specific, concrete recommendation is we have to name and shame, and we have to expose these people. And I think one of the most effective vehicles that we can do to start changing behavior is have some sort of sanctioning capability for people that are engaged at a high-level government official, just like we do with GLOMAG, Congressman. You know, we've worked with you a lot on that. But something like and similar that we can expose these people, name and shame them, otherwise it's never going to change. And it will also encourage, for the very thing that Mr. Parle said, people to come forward. But particularly women don't feel as though there's any justice over there. And so, and unfortunately, this cuts across both sides, young boys and young girls. But I think if we could do this, because it's done at a high level, government level, both in Liberia right now, we know that, and we will put together a package for you, Congress, on something like this. Certainly it happened in Sierra Leone. The chief minister, all he did was resign, and it swept under because of the close ties of the high level government officials. So until you sanction them for this type of behavior, it's not going to stop, in my opinion, because there's nothing we can do to change their judicial system in the short term. We would love to do that, but it's not. But I do know from our experience and our work in the sanctions arena, that gets people's attention. Nobody wants to be sanctioned by the U.S. government. And also, it doesn't, when you sanction an individual, it's not sanctioning the country. So people, that's a first defense that they will use. Look what you're doing to the country. You're hurting aid. No, we're coming after you because you are engaged in this despicable behavior, public corruption or human rights violations. But I think we need to find some vehicle that we could tie in this specific behavior, because if you get sanctioned for this type of behavior, I think it's going to send a very powerful message to other people, not just on the continent of Africa, but elsewhere. Because that's one thing, for all of our ills in the United States, that's one thing that we rarely engage in, and that's ritualistic killings. And I think this is a time and place to do something and take a leadership role. Thank you.
Let me just ask you, on that issue of changing behavior, how much of this would you say is a true believer on the part of the occult and the demonic aspect to this? I'm always reminded that in the book of Leviticus, chapter 18, Moses said, "Do not sacrifice your children to Moloch." We know that was being done by some, and it was a hideous practice of child sacrifice to appease the underworld god, which is the devil. And I'm just wondering if you do they really believe it? When these people are abusing these children, and not all children, in such a horrific way, that this is somehow truly appropriating power to themselves from what?
Yes, sadly enough, they do. And I was able to witness this firsthand in 2002 when I got over there, because they literally believed this from the civil wars, the rebels that were engaged in it, and then even after the wars were over. So there is a underbelly of darkness that none of us here can really understand, but it does exist. It's very real. And unless we expose it, it's going to continue, in my opinion.
And but you mentioned, I think, or you, Dr. White, about that the church, the Catholic Church, came out very strongly. Where is the faith entities with regards to this? When they speak out, are they listened to by their governments? The fact sheet that's put out by World Hope points out that the House of Representatives of Nigeria in 2021 introduced, doesn't say pass, introduced a resolution declaring a state of emergency related to ritual killings. Are they finally getting it? These politicians, presidents, as well as their families, or is it a means to an end to, again, somehow appropriate power from the evil one?
Thank you, Chairman Smith. I wanted to speak on that behavior change. Sure. It is true that we have a segment of people who believe that traditional medicine mixed with blood will actually heal their social problems. I have handled a number of cases. 4 months ago, I had a father who killed his son. He had 7. He was guided by a witch doctor that when you kill one, you will actually save 6 and you become rich. So there is a segment. But of course, what is fueling it is what I talked about, the politics, commerce, and then which is basically exploitation. So the witch doctors use it to exploit the vulnerable community members who are poor, and then the people believe it. If we really want to have a sustainable solutions that can end these practices, not only ritualistic sacrifice, but also any other form of violence, we need to use training to reverse the demand. Because if you look at trafficking, it's just about the demand. If you cut the demand, then supply is actually of no use. and the demand comes from those who seek solutions to the witch doctors. Or if it is trafficking, people who come and they are seeking body parts, and that's why the agent becomes active. But when you cut demand, it's a chain. So when you cut off demand, supply is of no use. And the sustainable solution is basically about some of the things is training to reverse the belief. Then the other is prevention. We talked about prevention. Like I told you, there are many countries where they have arrested perpetrators of such crimes, but we don't have laws to try the perpetrators. And the ingredients of ritualistic murder are different from the murder or trafficking, because with this, like I said, they are now no longer transporting the victims. They are killing the victims from their very homes. So we need to help countries so that they have the laws which are very preventive. The laws can prevent. In my country, we arrested one of the famous rich man, and it became a nationwide advocacy, and the media started reporting about it. But it's only Uganda that has drafted a law that can address human sacrifice. When you go to countries like Sierra Leone, Nigeria, they don't have laws. They are arresting the perpetrators, take them to police. After a while, they go back. And when a perpetrator gets out, if he has killed 2, he kills more. And even he comes back for even us, the actors.
So you said Uganda has a law?
Yes.
The others do not, or they have weak laws?
They haven't drafted laws specifically that can address ritualistic murder. And if you look at Africa, the concept of witchcraft is widely spread. Witchcraft is everywhere in Africa. So ritualistic murders are now escalating because politicians are using it to win elections, people are using it to get rich, because the exploitation is across Africa. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I ask you, Ms. Fuller, and you might want to respond to that too, but just tell us a little bit more about how, I mean, as Obed told us, 90% die. Did I get that right? But there are 10% who survive, and then there are others who are probably, you know, for some reason they never do go through it, or their family members go through it, and they have to deal with the pain and agony, the healing process. Could you speak to that?
Yes, Chairman Smith and committee members. It's sad to say that the issue of ritual murder and organ harvesting is really an heinous crime. Like I mentioned in my testimony, the post-traumatic stress disorder for those who have experienced this kind of crime is like continuing. It's a pain that they feel for almost the rest of their lives, even if they would have healed physically. And this is the situation for even the survivor I'm present here with today. And wanting to go back to when you talked about behavior change, the sad reality is that yes, a lot of Africans do believe in witchcraft and ritual murder. For me, for us to be able to combat this, we have to have tougher measures and holding governments accountable. Like Dr. Allen mentioned, for no government wants to be sanctioned, especially by the US. Most of, including the country that I come from, is donor-driven. We depend a lot for funding from US and foreign governments to be able to pull through on our budget. So if sanctions or funding opportunities are tied to things, I love the idea of including the facts of ritual murder into the trafficking reports. I know Sierra Leone, and I worked closely with the anti-trafficking agency, that they do take the trafficking report seriously. So if they know they will have to provide figures and actions that will be put into the trafficking report, I know they will take actions, because we have to move people to be able to act. Another thing also is working with communities. For example, in Sierra Leone, communities are silent. The culture of silence is huge. We have to be able to help communities to speak out, to be able to make reports. And for example, what we are doing in Sierra Leone is working with paramount chiefs. Paramount chiefs are really influential in those communities. We are doing it in 4 hotspot district areas with contract from the Georgia University through the African Programming Initiative to End Slavery. What we are doing in those 4 hotspot districts is to work with paramount chiefs so that they are able to include in their bylaws laws that will protect children, including trafficking. So if we could be able to work more with communities to help them to speak out, to train community structures to be able to speak out about those things, I think it will make a lot of difference if we are able, because paramount chiefs are like the custodians of the culture. So if we start to work with them and community structures, then we are building a community that will be able to speak out for themselves and make report. Because once those things are exposed, then people will not continue those crimes. It is because most of these things are shredded in secrecy. That is what is fueling the act. And we cannot also forget religious leaders. Religion in Sierra Leone is a big issue. If we can be able to work with religious leaders so that they are able to use their pulpits to be able to speak to the minds of individuals, I believe we'll be able to have the shifts in terms of how they behave.
Hey, just on that last point, if I may, Ms. Fuller, I was thinking as this testimony was taking place that religious leaders could be used or could be effective, I should say, in changing some of these traditions and cultures. And I'm wondering who you think from our side should be the effective communicators with religious leaders. Other clergy, is that the best way to approach religious leaders and try to change their way of thinking and get them to communicate with their congregations and that kind of thing?
Yes, I was thinking that they should be included in our programs. Like when we are writing out our projects, they should be included as to how we could work with them and how they could work with their congregation as to sensitize their communities based on their faith, and as to how people could make the shift and be able to protect their communities.
Thank you.
Let me ask you, I did mention earlier that I had really began to learn about the Juju men when I was in Nigeria. And I heard the story that happened frequently in Benin City. And I heard it from a woman who actually was trafficked for 5 years in Rome, not all in Rome, but much of it. And Sister Eugenia, who does a great rescue in Rome, she actually goes out with vans and brings in women who have been forced into trafficking off the streets. And many of them say no because of the fear before they left. A ritual was performed over them, and they were told, horrible things will happen if you don't do exactly what the trafficker says. And she had that same issue. Elizabeth was her name, the young woman. And she said only when the faith of, in her case, Jesus Christ, came to bear, did she realize that she has nothing to fear. That greater is he that is within you than he is within the world. And the same would apply, I believe, to Judaism and other faiths. But that they had nothing to fear. And yet, there is a fear factor there that's very profound. I don't fully understand it with regards to what it's like on a day-to-day basis in Africa, like why people don't turn in the witch doctor, why the police don't arrest, but maybe they don't have the laws to do it with. But how much power does that fear factor? Because this Elizabeth went on and on. She was a very amazing woman, and just amazing. And her life was turned around by her faith. But she said there's so many other young women who are just captive, and they walk around in fear that they can't deviate from what the trafficker says. So, Obed, you wanted to speak on that?
Yes, thank you, Chairman Smith. Addressing issues of harmful beliefs is not something easy. It's something I've walked a journey of 12 years, and I've studied for some long time. The reason as to why even some politicians or leaders or government officials in police or even some judges in courts shy away from helping to address, to reverse this, is because some of them subscribe to the same practice. That's number one. Number two, in all our communities we have faith leaders, which is just like a hanging fruit. These are agents of change. Sometimes most times if they understand a message, they can actually reverse those harmful practices, because the rest of the key people in our communities fear to confront. So there's a lot of fear. But when faith leaders as agents of change embrace a certain issue, they will always crack through the lines and they will always speak against it. Why? Most people in our countries, they subscribe to a certain faith group, either Christian or Islamic. And there is a coexistence. You find people who go to the shrines are the same people who go to a church or a mosque. So when the faith leaders speak boldly about an issue, most times the public will pick it up, and before you know it, there is a chain of collective efforts to address it. So I think we need to integrate that as part of our prevention, to work with faith congregation across board, because people in our communities believe in witch doctors the same way they believe in faith leaders. So at that level, where we have things that people fear to talk about, including politicians or government officials who subscribe to those harmful practices, working with faith leader is kind of a very perfect approach, which can help us penetrate through the lines. Thank you.
Just ask you, in terms of how many witch doctors are there? Is there any, of course it'd be very hard to even do a guesstimate on that, but is there any sense as to how many? And was 20,000 victims or more than, is that an accurate estimate per year of this crime? And let me just ask you as well, does the African Union, based out of Addis Ababa, do anything on this?
Thank you, Chairman Smith. Currently, the AU has actually not also embraced efforts to address ritualistic murders and child sacrifices. So this would be a good opportunity to also, so that we extend accountability measures to the AU, because I talked about more than 30 countries now hit by this practice, and children continue to die. However, like I said, when something comes from the approach of bottom to top bottom works better for African countries, like my colleague was saying. If things like sanctions start to come out, again, it's kind of a wake-up call to the agenda of some of the regional coalitions and the AU in particular. They will wake up and start to pursue this as something of interest. But like Chairman Smith, like I said, if you look at even the categories of the way we look at trafficking, human sacrifice and ritualistic murders are not yet categorized under there. So if we come out boldly to highlight this as an issue, so it will be a wake-up call as well to so many actors, including the leadership of different state heads in Africa.
Just how do the witch doctors go into that practice? Is it something that a witch doctor passes on to a son or a friend? How does that happen, Ms. Fuller?
Witchcraft is an influence. Sometimes it's passed from parents to children or through community members. Like I said, an example is the case that happened 2 months ago of a father who approached a witch doctor, and the witch doctor told him that you have 7 children, kill one, and you will be rich. And the father went ahead, he killed his son. Now as I talk, the family has been totally broken down. So they are not related, but some of these harmful practices are passed on, because there are some members of our communities who look at it as an exploitative avenue. To the politicians who want to win elections, they have been deceived and they believe it. To the police or the judicial system, the judges or the officers in those high-ranking offices in government, they are paid bribes and they will never judge a case because someone is benefiting from it. All in all, it's an organized crime, which very sophisticated. So we need, our response should be high level so that we are able to counteract all the barriers that are involved in addressing this issue.
In terms of investigations, are there investigative journalists that have, taken the time and the effort to uncover these atrocities? I mean, as a result of this hearing, we will be putting out all kinds of press to the Africa Press Corps, and whether or not any of them pick up on it will remain to be seen. But are they lax? Are they believers in the occult?
Chairman Smith, thank you very much. Even for the first time for me to get to know about this issue, it was reported in the media. That is in 2009. I can't tell you when it started happening, but the media is another avenue. The same way we talked about faith leaders or the religious leaders. The media has helped so much to report some of the cases where bodies have been cut, and sometimes the media has also promoted such practices. So it's both. In African countries, the media has promoted the work of witch doctors. We have a number of adverts which are run by the media houses that advertise the work of witch doctors. But we know that it's an avenue where we can work with the media team globally, not only in our countries, so that we start to create awareness, to bring it to the agenda of every leader. But we need to use the media, because the witch doctors are occupying this space and they're advertising and fueling. And we also need to come so that we work with the media houses to make sure that we use this platform to create awareness.
Thank you. Any further?
One last thing. A couple of you have mentioned, maybe three of you have mentioned that at times of elections, the numbers rise, which is something I had never heard of before, never even thought of. As is well known, we often have delegations to observe elections in other countries, mostly there to ensure vote security and that kind of thing, not this kind of issue. Is there any kind of work surrounding elections when they're scheduled, so we have a sense of when they're going to happen? I don't know how far in advance of an election this kind of conduct tends to increase, but is there anything surrounding elections that we can do that would help? Any of you? Feel free.
Yes, thank you very much. It is true. Actually, we get worried in our countries whenever it's time to vote. Parents start to hide their children, and indeed cases go high. It is believed that the more children you kill, the more chances you have to win elections. When you asked what can be done, indeed we need to integrate prevention and surveillance. Most times in our countries, the guidelines of elections look at only casting a vote, counting it, and people jubilate, they go home. Behind that, before the real casting of a vote is when they kill many children, actually months and months before elections, and there are no guidelines provided.
In what we would think of as the campaign season leading up to the election.
Exactly.
Yes? Okay.
And that's why in our recommendation we are talking about the zero tolerance. Sometimes we do not look at zero tolerance across from all the partners, including those who come to observe. we would look at the process rather than the outcome. As we look at, we celebrate the democratic processes, behind that blood has been shed. And they are shedding blood for the most innocent children who even don't know the essence of an election. So we need to come up with zero tolerance on the support that we provide to the African countries. More so, we need also to come up with guideline and surveillance, because this is reported in so many reports how the cases rise and then they go down after the elections. And there are some even African leaders, he read so many, who believe that you can change, you can sustain power because you've actually murdered children.
I'm just going to stop you there because I want to hear from any others that want to comment on the election aspect.
I think that's an excellent point. Perhaps maybe DRL might be best equipped. This is on our side of the aisle, could do an assessment. Maybe, I know they do their annual human rights work, but I don't see a lot of work done on ritualistic killings. But I think, to get to your point, they could include that in their assessment and investigation, and they can look for those types of trends to give you some more specificity. But I think that's an excellent point, and perhaps based on information that we get from DRL in their report, we look at that, then maybe perhaps as part of the election monitoring efforts, we can insist that maybe, whether it's IRI or NED, whoever it may be that's involved in that they look at that. And then you can kind of get a benchmark, how far out do we look at these things? And maybe that's what we're looking at to see if there's been a spike in it. But I think that that's an excellent observation. Thank you.
Did anybody else want to comment on that?
Yes. So for me, I was thinking that you were asking like what those who go to monitor elections could do. I was thinking that it could be included in the elections guidelines as to some of the ways governments are supposed to conduct themselves before and after elections.
Thank you. At a minimum, I would hope that we wouldn't invite elected officials who have participated in this kind of thing to the United States to be honored or to meet, the president or members of Congress or whatever. I think that that's an important part as well, that we recognize that. And there's often a real challenge between accountability and diplomacy, as I have discovered on being on the Committee on Foreign Affairs. So that's always interesting. But thank you so much to all of you. I need to run, but really appreciate it.
Just a couple of points. This gives a new definition to clean and free and fair elections. I mean, very often it's money, whether or not there's undercount or overcount, all those kinds of issues. This has not been part of the dialogue ever, as far as I know. So I thank you for that, for letting us know that. The DRL idea is a good one. I think we could put together a letter immediately that would ask them, and maybe use the Liberian election as an example for them to look at. If there's nothing there, great. If there is something there, we need to know about it, and it needs to be held to account. So I thank you for that recommendation, Dr. White. I just want to, again, thank all of you for your testimonies, for your leadership, which is extraordinary. If you have anything further you'd like to say before I'll conclude the hearing, or anybody? Thank you. The hearing is adjourned, and members have 5 legislative days if they want to submit. Some of our members that were here, I'm sure, wanted to give opening comments, and with that'll be made part of the record. And without objection, the hearing is adjourned.